I don't think I will need the whole 9 minutes, but I might take it.
Okay.
So I'm Angela Mooney, DRC. I'm from the Yahashimi Nation, one Inyo Band of Mission Indians. I'd like to start the hearing by acknowledging that we're here on the, on the shared territory of the Tongva and the Hashiman peoples. That's relevant always in terms of protocol to start by acknowledging whose land you're on. It's particularly relevant in the context of the Coastal Commission for the reasons that I'll get to in a moment. I have 4 things that I'd like to talk about this morning. The first is that I want to reiterate what I stated at a press conference at the Santa Monica Commission hearing in March, and that is that despite this commission's existence being over 42 years old, and despite the fact that there are over 40 Native nations in California with ancestral ties to the coastlands, there's never been a single representative on the commission from a California Native nation. So I'd like to encourage the commission and staff and everyone involved in the new hiring process and in the call for diversification of the commission to seriously encourage considering the fact that it's time to have a California Indian on the Coastal Commission. It's pretty abhorrible in my mind that we've gone 42 years without that, considering the history of California and the particular culpability of the state of California in state-sponsored genocide against California Indians. So when we fast forward 40 years, there's definitely a direct connection with continued silencing of Indigenous nations and that history. And I'm confident that, as we'll see when we get to my other points, the Commission can work together with Native nations, with my organization, Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples, to rectify what I know is not out of ill intent, but is an oversight. So I'm confident we can do that together, but I want to highlight that for you, and I'm going to highlight it every opportunity I get because, again, it's critical that we have Native nation representation on this Commission. Which brings me to the next point, which is in the process of working on researching the banning ranch issue and whether or not appropriate consultation, government-to-government consultation with my nation and the Tongva Nation has occurred. One of the things that's come up is that, from my understanding, the California Coastal Commission is actually not in compliance with Governor Brown's Executive Order B-10-11, which was the call for, which was first acknowledging that Native nations, federally recognized and unrecognized in California, have unique cultural information and are sovereign nations whom should be consulted on all projects likely to impact their cultural sites. In that executive order, Governor Brown also called on all agencies under his purview to develop tribal consultation policies and procedures. Natural Resource Agency has developed such policies and procedures, Caltrans, various state agencies. To my knowledge, California Coastal Commission has at no point even started the process of developing these tribal consultation policies and procedures. And as you'll see when I get to my third point, that matters greatly because where the California Coastal Commission is, with all due respect, compared to where other state agencies are, regarding tribal consultation is not good. Looking at the staff report from the Banning Ranch proposal, it's operating like 1950s in terms of some of those recommendations. And again, I don't attribute that to any malintent on the part of commissioners or staff. What I attribute it to is the fact that the consultation policies and procedures that need to be developed haven't been developed. I think that once those procedures are developed and in place, you'll see a dramatic improvement in the relationship between the commissioners and Native nations. So that brings me to my next point. And again, Sacred Places Institute is happy to work with the commission and staff to get yourself in compliance with Brown's executive order. And why does this matter? So I'm going to use Banning Ranch as an example. I recognize that it's been postponed on the calendar, but I want to talk about it a bit, particularly in terms of the recommended conditions proposed by staff regarding so-called archaeological resources. So I believe that the staff report acknowledges even explicitly that there's been no meaningful consultation with Native nations. What there has been is a developer invited 2 tribal representatives to tour the site in 2009. If you had policies and procedures in place for tribal consultation, you would know that under no rubric does one invited meeting to walk a site in any way, shape, or form meet the burden of effective tribal consultation, which is, again, exactly why we need such policies and procedures in place. So the tribal nations, to my knowledge, neither the Tongva nor the Yahashimi nations have ever received a copy of any archaeological plan, any archaeological report, any significance testing or data recovery report, and nor does the staff propose conditions mandate providing that information to tribal nations. It says it needs to be provided to a Native American monitor, but again, limiting that and excluding the Native nations and the government-to-government consultation from those recommendations is way out of step with where the rest of California state agencies are in terms of consultation with Native nations. There's been no follow-through, up until, we'll say, 6 weeks ago, there's been no follow-through from the developer or the commission or the lead agencies, as far as we can tell, to do due diligence with regard to tribal consultation. And that's evident from the recommended policies and procedures, because those recommended policies and procedures say things like recommending significance testing and data recovery, which, if you're not familiar, it means excavation. So there are parts of those conditions that recommend data recovery and testing of, to be clear, people that I'm a descendant from's remains. Under no circumstances for tribal nations is that an acceptable mitigation measure. And I think the fact that it's included in this draft document is clear evidence that there's much work that needs to be done in terms of consulting with Native nations. I know of no Native nation in California that would recommend excavation of our ancestral remains and scientific testing to verify their significance. And I know of no Native nation that would accept those terms. So, in terms of banning ranch, I think that I'm very glad it's not on the agenda, because they really do need to go back to the drawing board and consult with Native nations. Another thing I want to raise on this is that the proposed open space and the proposed conservation 501c3 that would run with that, there's not a single Native representative on the board that's proposed by the developer at this point. I think that's absolutely ridiculous when you consider the amount of development that's happened in Orange County and the number of Ahashiman and Tongva sacred sites that have been destroyed before things like the Coastal Commission existed, before things like the Native American Graves Protection Act existed. So we're in this position now where that's just simply not acceptable terms. So before anything moves forward with banning ranch, I think both the commission and the staff and the developer need to really do due diligence and go back to the drawing board and consult directly with Native nations. The final thing that I want to highlight is the letter that was introduced into record yesterday and a testimony presented by Susan Jordan regarding the call to have the hearing on banning ranch within Orange County territory. This is really significant, and you may bear with me for a moment because you may not see the relationship between 3 layers of colonization and genocide against California Indians and the need to hold the hearing in Orange County. But stick with me for a minute and 4 seconds and I'll get there. The connection is, at no point since the 3 layers of colonization and the state-sponsored efforts at genocide against my ancestors and other Native nations has there been a point in time when the descendants of those Native nations have been in positions of power, right? We're not in control of the government, we're not on commissions, we don't have this power. And so we're not, as a people, particularly those of us from unrecognized nations, such as the Tongva and Ahashiman, by and large, we're not the economically advantaged portion of society. So when you take something like banning ranch, when you take an issue that represents one of the last remaining open spaces within our ancestral territory, that's on the Sacred Lands Inventory, that's eligible for listing on the state historic register and eligible for listing as a traditional cultural property on the National Register of Historic Places, it's fundamentally critical that you have that hearing in the ancestral homeland of those people. It's absolutely unacceptable to hold that hearing outside of the territory where the people who've been most disenfranchised are not going to be able to get to due to these types of considerations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bruce Bertram.